Hello everybody, doing a video. It's good to be doing them because there's always something new to talk about in relation to Berlin. Now I have a Depeche Mode album called Music for the Masses, and this is a cover that's always bothered me. You know, it was always like in the back of my mind. I mean, I can say I'm a Depeche Mode fan. I've never got to see them. Unfortunately, Andy Fletcher has since passed away, so there's only two members of the band left. That's Dave Gahan and Martin Gore. And but this was with the classic lineup. So you had Dave Gahan, Martin Gore, Andy Fletcher and Alan Wilder. That's without doubt the classic lineup. Now they did this album just after the Berlin Trilogy, which was Some Great Reward, Construction Time Again and Black Celebration. This is the album that they did after that. This came out in 1987. Why I'm talking about this album is because of its cover. Now, it's a cover that's always sort of bothered me, because I'd always ask myself the question, what is it trying to communicate? Now, I know it does say music for the masses, but it can be interpreted in many different ways. Now, only recently, I finished the book by Kurt Reese, which is this book here. There's nothing to show with this because there's no serious cover, but there it is, The Berlin Story, Kurt Reese. And it was through reading that book that I suddenly understood what this cover means, or at least what it means to me, because everybody will have a different interpretation as to what it means. Now, as this album was being recorded, the Cold War was still in effect. It didn't come to an end until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So, like I said, this bothered me for over 30 years, that the meaning of this particular album cover with these speaker-like kind of, you know, sort of absolute. I wouldn't know how to best describe them, but I just say that they're speakers, sort of loudspeakers. It's almost like a call to arms, you could say. And I also remember in the Prisoner, the TV show, The Prisoner with Patrick McGowan, who they'd always make these announcements on these loudspeakers. So anyway, after reading Kurt Reese, The Berlin Story, I said to myself, I've cracked the code. I know what this now means. In Berlin, at the time, after the end of the war, especially the Battle for Berlin, and only after the Allies got to Berlin, because Russia got there first, they won the Battle for Berlin, and then the Allies, that was the Americans, the British and the French, got to Berlin in July of 1945. So Berlin was divided into 4 zones. I've mentioned this many times, but for those that haven't, are seeing this video for the first time, you have the Russian zone, which was the largest chunk. Then you had the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone. And once the Allies got to Berlin, and they were then in charge of their particular zones, they set up these speakers, these loudspeakers, and because Berlin at the time had no electricity, or very little electricity. So a lot of the Berliners and those that were living in Berlin, the only light that they had was candlelight. But there was a particular time that they were able to get out of their homes, or it might have been cellars, buildings that were half destroyed, but partially, that the other part of the Berlin was still, it was livable, you could still live in it. I mean, it was grim at the time, and the winters were blissful, very, very cold. So anyway, there was a certain time that they would go to these fixed locations where they would listen to the radio, and it would be coming out of these great big speakers. And what that was a radio station called RIAS, and this was set up by the Americans. And what the Americans wanted to do was to influence the Berliners into the American way of life. It was to socialize the German people and the Berliners into how, the American way of life, which is what everybody aspired to. I mean, when you think about it, a lot of the great bands, or the legacy bands as you could call them, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Kinks, the Small Faces, Pink Floyd, they're all war babies. They were influenced by their surroundings, which, and Britain at the time was badly bombed, and therefore it was relatively grim. It wasn't as how we live today. In those days, it was they were living under austerity. Britain was nearly bankrupt, and so what these bands did, they looked up, as we all did, to the Americans, because the Americans had the glamour and the American dream, and Hollywood and rock and roll and swing, as it was at the time, but eventually went into rock and roll, jazz, and westerns and all of that. And so after the destruction of the continent, the European continent, everybody was hoping for a better life. They were looking towards the future and hoping things would get better. And this is what the Americans promised when they went there. However, this was an opportunity to influence, and you could say brainwash, the population of Europe, and specifically Germany and Berlin, with a radio station called RIAS. Now, I've got a book here, Kennedy and the Berlin Wall. Now, if you see there, I'm not sure if you could see it. You might have to freeze frame it at some point. You will see it says RIAS. So RIRS. That was the radio station that they played the Berliners. That was coming out of speakers like this to the population. And RIAS was effectively run by the CIA. Now, who would ever think of that? At the time, I forgot to bring it. It's now come to mind that I've got a document in book form, and at the back it's got like a lot of newspaper cuttings of the time, specifically of just before the building of the Berlin Wall. And they were saying, the headline was RIAS propaganda. Well, they were right. But if a Berliner or West Berliner was to read that, they would say, "Oh, that's just nonsense. That's GDR propaganda, or the Deutsche Demokratische Republik propaganda," and they wouldn't pay much attention to it. But in East Berlin and in East Germany, they probably would. So when I read it and I saw it, I said, they're spot on. It's exactly what it was. It was propaganda. It was the influencing the German society after the war into the American way of life. And it's continued ever since. So if you think of marketing, narratives, propaganda, PR, it's all to influence you in a certain way of thinking, and it's influencing you to buy. You know, so when you become a consumer of goods, and even of goods that you don't particularly need, it's in order for you to spend money on things that, you know, would make your life better, but in the long run it probably wouldn't. So that pretty much concludes my short video on this album cover, because I really was, you know, I went out of my way to buy this cover, because I can't remember if I had it on CD or I had it on cassette tape back in the 80s. But, you know, to have it on vinyl and to have it specific and to buy it specifically for this cover, just to show all my viewers on YouTube what this cover means to me. Because, you know, does Martin Gore or David Gahan or any of the other members of Depeche Mode, were they thinking the way I thought? I doubt it. But because of their connection to Berlin with their Berlin, the albums that they made, the Berlin trilogy albums that they made, and this is the album after they finished those Berlin trilogy. And I will say this, I would say they're more of the Berlin trilogy than, say, David Bowie's trilogy. But I mean, that's my personal opinion. I'm sure there are David Bowie fans that will disagree with me. But like I said, Low and Lodger were not recorded in Berlin, whereas the Depeche Mode albums, Some Great Reward, Construction Time Again and Black Celebration were, even though they did the pre-production in London. And this is the album that came after it. So keeping with the theme of the Cold War, I think they hit the spot with this cover. Anyway, that concludes my presentation. I hope you will all give us a thumbs up and leave us a comment and show your support in some way, and maybe come up with an idea for some future videos if you're so interested. And alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und grüß dich und fall nicht nieder.